Today we are in conversation with the Right Honourable Sir Desmond Swayne MP of New Forest Green. He was Parliamentary Private Secretary to David Cameron, both during his time as Leader of the Opposition in 2005 and 2010. In September 2012, he was appointed as Lord Commissioner of Her Majesty's Treasury, and in July 2014 as Minister of International Development. Mr. Desmond Swayne is a key ally of the Eurosceptic movement, fighting for independence of Britain, and was a prominent critic of the British government's response to COVID-19. Today we shall be discussing current Brexit-related agendas, post-COVID problems, and the economy in Britain. My name is Neil Limbu, contributor and commentator for the Bruges Group. Firstly, I want to touch upon your article you published a week ago for The Express. You highlight the very possibility of Starmer flogging away Brexit with the second referendum. The potential is certain. I did an article for the Bruges Group of this very dystopian idea of a woke triumvirate of Labour, Lib Dems, and the SNP coalition that would thwart the hard work of Brexit. How can we as little platooners and individuals halt this very action of a second referendum?
Well, I think the issue is that whilst Keir Starmer has made it abundantly clear that he's moved away from the agenda of rejoining Europe, he regards that as deeply damaging to his electoral chances. But that hasn't permeated through to the members of his party, and certainly not to the other opposition parties, who are resolute in their determination to rejoin. And every time there's a question of the benefits of Brexit being discussed in the chamber of the House of Commons, Labour MPs pile in, how this has all been a dreadful mistake and we ought to correct it by going back. And so when you start to see policies being discussed by the Labour Party at the highest level of extending the franchise to 3.5 million settled EU citizens in this country, a bigger electorate than the whole of the size of Wales, it begs the question to anyone thinking, well, what could be the possible motive for that? Is that, one suggestion surely is that if you were contemplating a move to a further referendum on the question of EU membership, marshalling 3.5 million EU citizens into that equation would have a very significant impact. So I merely put that out there as something that people should discuss. And as for what little platoons should do, I think what little platoons do best, talk about it amongst their friends, so that talk about it on social media, use every platform that you have to raise concerns like this, so that ordinary people who don't think about Brexit and rejoining the EU constantly, who might have busy lives and might catch a couple of news headlines on the early evening news, actually register these things, which otherwise they won't.
Certainly. This seems, at least from my end, that it's a very anti-democratic way of thinking, especially with the Remainers who try to thwart the basic movement of Brexit. Using social media and new forms of technology is practically the way forward of providing that message that we've got Brexit done and now we need to reap the benefits.
Oh, well, I agree. And I think that the frustration that most people have, if you look at the polling with respect to Brexit, is they attribute all the things that have gone wrong in the last couple of years or so and wrap that all up in post-Brexit. And the reality is that there's no connection whatsoever. And if you look at the performance of the German economy, ours is pretty well matched. It's not as if there's been some sudden deterioration as a consequence of Brexit. But certainly we've not seen a great flood of benefits. But I frankly never was naive enough to expect that. This is going to be a change over a number of years.
We remember fondly of yourself as the crusader against the harsh COVID lockdowns and its ultimate consequences it's having on Britain currently. Firstly, I wanted to touch upon the dangerous impetus it created around the sharp authority of the government. With a quick blink, all of a sudden, the UK was under the sharp authority of the health and scientific lobby and bureaucratic sectors. Do you think this created a totalitarian like precedent, creating unease for the vast amount of liberties we ought to protect?
Well, that has been my view from the start. All the powers set out in the 1984 Public Health Act, which were used for the purposes of ruling by decree. My word, didn't George Orwell show some prescience in choosing that year as the name for his dystopian novel? But the issue, as I saw it all along, was, yes, Parliament being circumvented by rule of decree and only subsequently seeking consent for the measures that it took, taking away our liberties. But I have to temper that with the knowledge that actually the government had acquired substantial public support for the actions that it was taking. I was always conscious that I was speaking for a minority, but in a democracy, minorities deserve to be heard.
Mm, To simply put it, the government needs to hear everyone's opinion, no matter what the circumstances. Even in such a sensitive time as COVID, the opposition needs to be heard.
Well, the opposition, I'm afraid, supported the government. Indeed, the opposition, the official opposition, wanted, even more severe measures than the government was imposing. What's effectively silenced opposition in Parliament, opposition with a small o, was one, the fact that we were encouraged to remain in our constituencies and do things with all the limitations of Zoom. But equally, what happened was the government, using the powers set out in the Public Health Act 1984, effectively ruled by decree and then sought parliamentary sanction subsequently, rather than having the debate and the questioning before measures were taken, which meant that effectively you'd already been presented with fait accompli. You had already got an order in council or a measure enacted in law before you came to debate it in Parliament. And, it's very difficult for ministers to acknowledge arguments against the actions that they've already taken when they weren't held to account and questioned about them, and the data subjected to proper parliamentary scrutiny, rigorous scrutiny, before those actions were taken.
Hmm. Aside from the soft powers like the scientific lobby causing unease, it seemed like the latches of tyranny really came from the big technology media giants, as the likes of Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or even the likes like Google, would suppress freedom of speech, the expression of information and ideas between debates surrounding COVID with these so-called fact checkers. This culture of posting truth, becoming exact truth to these social media giants, is dangerous in the sense that they're policing thought. Is regulations to such tyranny like policies against these big tech companies needed to secure individual thought? Or what's the solution to this matter?
Well, the bill that is currently going through Parliament and is now in the House of Lords, been through the House of Commons, will take measures to affect this. I mean, clearly, the you have no right to express your opinion in a newspaper. You've no right to have your article or your letter published any more than you have a right for your opinion to be published on a IP or on an internet provider's platform. But what was thoroughly, I think, unnecessary was the way that certain people and certain opinions were silenced. And I think that the bill that is currently in Parliament will certainly address that, because it will give Ofcom the powers to see that the information providers' own rules and standards are fairly applied across all opinions. But now that you've raised this point, because of the stance that I took, I received a great deal of support from clinicians, scientists, uh, anyone from a junior doctor in an IT unit through to a clinical professor at the top of his game, they would provide me with their data, their insights, and their effectively giving me ammunition to use in the argument against government policy. But what was worrying was that this was all done on the condition of their own absolute confidentiality, so that they couldn't be fingered. And I think in a free society where scientists who are, whose daily job is to evaluate evidence and subject it to rigorous evaluation, they're frightened to express their opinions and put their head above the parapet because such is the level of um, vitriol in the public sphere on public media and the way that they would be trashed and their reputations um, questioned in the public sphere, I think is very, very dangerous in a free society.
Mhm.
I mean, I can take insults. I'm a politician. I get a salary for that. I mean, to be fair to the Guardian, in one of the articles that appeared in that publication, it didn't say I was a child molester, only that I looked like one. But for a politician, that's water off a duck's back. But for much of the scientific community, I think they were frightened to engage in the argument. Certainly, that was my impression from the emails that I got. They're happy to give me their insights and their data and their analysis, but not to have their name attached to it.
Certainly, it's this rule by fear, I suppose. They don't want to have their name out of fear and spite that their own community or their own bosses will lash out at them.
You've got in the public sphere now a sort of orthodoxy. And to question the orthodoxy is to set yourself apart and subject yourself, one, to a measure of unpleasantness in the way that arguments take place, and two, increasingly worryingly, an attempt to simply silence you. And we've seen that most notoriously in the ideology of gender and sex, but it is unfortunately spreading to other spheres as well. And certainly that was my impression during the pandemic. There was certainly a demand that dissenters, no matter how, no matter their credentials as scientists, is that they should keep their mouths shut or expect consequences.
Yes. One of the lasting impacts COVID has had on the UK is the current economic slump we are facing. For business owners, the health lobby thought that overnight a year's lockdown could reopen the economy like it was back to usual. However, 43.1% of small businesses went under, while £21.1 billion was received by small business owners to keep them afloat. It seemed like, though, that wasn't enough for these small business owners. Was there any alternative to this policy of handing out money, or could the government deregulate COVID restrictions to solve this issue?
Well, I hate to be in the position of saying, well, we told you so. The fact is, you know, we we drew in Parliament attention to all these acts, consequences of what was a great national, no, let's be honest, international act of self-harm. And yes, I do believe that there were other ways of going about it. Um, we could have incentivized those groups that were particularly vulnerable and susceptible to the disease to shield themselves and isolate. I'm not saying it would have been straightforward, easy, or inexpensive, but it would have been um, a snip compared with the costs and consequences that we've imposed upon ourselves. And as for closing schools and things like that, I think these were just disastrous uh, decisions that were taken without thought to the consequences or any evaluation of the damage that was going to be done. But hey, remember, the public were, we're told by the pollsters, thirsting for even more restrictive measures. We had created a climate of fear where people were determined to remain at home. So it would have been interesting to have seen how that had turned out if we'd stuck with what was clearly the original intent to simply get through the winter months with the um, the advice that had initially been given of keeping certain distance and washing your hands regularly and those measures until we had got through the winter months with novovirus and flu and all the other impacts on the health service, and then rely on herd immunity and the spread amongst a healthy population that is able to deal with the disease as was manifest. Now, as I say, it wouldn't have been straightforward and it wouldn't have been inexpensive, but it would be much better than the policies that we adopted. And for all the criticisms that were heaped on Sweden and the warnings that were given to them about the number of deaths that they would receive, their outcome is undoubtedly much better than we've experienced.
Certainly. Going a bit more into education, of course. As you know, there was no A level GCSE exams. As a result, it was all teacher assessed. And as a result, it all inflated the grades. And now you have the situation, especially in universities, that they won't accept British citizens, British students, as that most of their grades have been inflated. And now in the job economy, you've seen that the actual market for jobs have been heavily reduced due to that number of inflated grades.
Well, that is not an area where I have expertise, but what is abundantly clear is a huge cohort of children have simply disappeared from school, having got into the habit of not going. And this is deeply worrying. And then you've got all those children who now have all sorts of anxieties and problems as a consequence of the experience of lockdown, and the damage that's been done and the huge efforts that teachers are having to put in to try and maintain a semblance of normality in schools. It's been an enormous endeavor to try and get back to normality, and we're nowhere near there yet.
Mm. Relating back to my earlier question on COVID and economy, do you think we've seen a direct relation between COVID regulations and the cost of living crisis?
You can't close down the economy at the same time as you are paying people to stay at home and do nothing to sustain their demand. So you're reducing productivity and nevertheless sustaining household expenditure. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. There was never going to be anything other than an inflationary consequence for the actions that we took. Now, it's arguable as to whether it would have been much worse had we not done that. It was the lesser of two evils, but clearly shutting down the economy has had an enormous impact that will take years to overcome. It's saddled us with a huge burden of debt, and it's also a very significant contributor to the inflation that we're experiencing.
Hmm. As a Brexiteer yourself, you fully know the Brexit benefits that the UK has gained from it. What would you say to the people that argue Britain's exit from the European Union has failed? And could you give us some quick fire facts to rebuttal these claims? Of course, as we know, Brexit hasn't been perfect and it's going to be a long process.
Well, there is one profound advantage that has accrued. We are now governed by people that we elect and whom we can remove. Whereas in the past, European laws, and we've had this argument about the amount of European law that the government is now prepared to remove from the statute book, but those laws, remember, were made in the European Council in absolute secrecy with by qualified majority voting with no transcript of the decision making process at all, um, well beyond our powers in Parliament to revoke or enact. And so the principal advantage is, as I say, we're now governed by ourselves. We're entirely responsible for our fate. I never believed that there was going to be a Brexit dividend that would be measurable within the first 4 or 5 years. But if you want one, we're doing pretty well by reference to our comparators. If you look at the performance of the German economy in the years since Brexit, and ours is almost as identical. And so, yes, of course, there are all sorts of things that have happened with respect to supply chains and other issues, but none of them can be brought to the door of Brexit.
Mm. One benefit on top of my head is Brexit has allowed us to optimize economic independence against our shackling of the European Union with our so-called benefits. Not only are, however, globalist groups are trying to downplay Brexit, but they seem to lose integrity while they undermine the benefits and the truth of Brexit. So recently, the IMF stated the UK economy will grow by 0.4%. Yet just weeks ago, they warned that it will contract down to 0.3%. Truly, should we even bother with these experts trying to downplay Brexit for the past 7 years? Or do they hold some certain truth to them?
Well, I mean, I've never had much faith in forecasting, and certainly not the forecasting record of the IMF. I mean, I remember the IMF holding George Osborne to account and saying his policies were going to be a disaster and lead to mass unemployment. Well, we had record employment. The absolute contrary of what they suggested was going to be the consequence of his policies, of which they disapproved. So I'm always skeptical about forecasting generally, but certainly with respect to the IMF. You know, people who've taken an anti-Brexit stance don't want to be proved wrong and will seize on any piece of evidence that they can to say, I told you so. But my position has always been this was going to be a thing that would change over 10, 20 years. And it's only then that you'll be able to look back and see the consequent changes that were made as a result of changes in trading policy and the rest. So it's going to be a great endeavor, but it's certainly far too soon to tell now.
Mm. The culture war, especially on the woke narrative, has driven itself from divisive Americanized politics, which has influenced Britain to which has no correlation to our nation, this so-called wokeness, in any shape or form. How can conservatives win this battle for truth and tradition against the progressive coalition that drive themselves from untruths imported from America?
Well, it's very interesting. I've been reading Professor Bigger's book on colonialism and looking at his experience, looking at the articles that he wrote and the response. And one of the things that strikes me as very odd, particularly amongst academics, who again are people you expect to evaluate evidence and make arguments. And what you get is assertion, a series of assertions. And even when you provide the detailed argument against the assertions that they make, instead of responding with a counter argument, they simply repeat the assertion. And we saw that with the roads must fall. A whole series of, accusations made against this dead man. And when academics answer on his behalf and say, well, actually, if you evaluate his actions and the policies and the stances and the things that he had said and don't misquote them or be so selective in your quotations, you can see that actually it's a very, very different picture. You're not dealing with a racist at all. But then you would then expect there to be a response, a measured response with reference to further evidence. But no, you just get a repetition of the original assertion that has been refuted. And I just find this bizarre that And that's what I find so discombobulating about the woke movement. I mean, I'm quite happy for people to take woke opinions. It's their choice. I believe in freedom of expression. What I can't understand is their inability to engage and their preference, on the contrary, to just silence any opposition. So when you get someone saying, giving a contrary opinion, as you did with the philosopher Professor Kathleen Stock at Sussex University, the answer is to silence her, to drive her from her position, and to cancel her at any speaking engagement at any other university. You know, this whole intention to close down debate and prevent it from taking place and create safe spaces for students where they can't hear any opinion that might challenge them or might upset them. You know, it's frankly pathetic.
Hmm, it certainly is. Finally, on the last question, it was, I think, just yesterday that Dominic Raab stepped down as the Conservative Party candidate for Esher and Walton. Well, this is a humongous blow for the Conservatives. Do you sense that the earlier forced resignation from the civil servants on the ground of quote unquote bullying played a part, as their scheming of delaying Brexit and halting Brexiteers is just a small piece in the bigger jigsaw?
I think it's a great shame. He was a great parliamentarian. He had a forensic mind, a great lawyer, and his before he became a minister, his work in opposition, both in absolute opposition, but also within the opposition within the governing party before he became a member of the government, I think was a huge contribution to the defence of our liberties. And I think it's a great shame. And frankly, I thought that I certainly wouldn't have accepted his resignation had I been prime minister on the basis of uh, the allegations and the report, the findings of the report. I think that, you know, he's just exacting in his standards, and some people find working for someone so exacting tough. Well, life is tough, and people need to toughen up, in my view. I've always had a slightly different view with respect to my own experience of the civil service as a minister. I always found that civil servants would do absolutely what I required them to do, however much they may have tried to persuade me not to. So a huge effort would be put in to please minister, no, 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 and telling me all the dreadful consequences that would flow from the actions that I was demanding that they take. But nevertheless, when that decision was made and I said, no, we're going to do it, we're going to do it this way, they would bend over backwards to do exactly what I wanted. So I'm always, you know, I accept that other ministers have had other experiences, but that's my own experience. I had certainly a very high regard for the civil service, but undoubtedly there is an element within government with the small g, which is, you know, politically motivated, and it shouldn't be. And I'm not entirely sure what the solution to that is. I think ministers have got to be much more robust and much, you know, we really do need ministers to have some sort of training from people like, for example, Ian Duncan Smith, whose, you know, experience of different ministries is extensive. You know, having a pep talk from someone like him before you go into a department would be quite helpful for many ministers, junior ministers, I think, in just wising them up to exactly how to conduct themselves and get things done in the teeth of opposition.
Well, I suppose that as the battle is tougher, we'll fight back, I suppose. And the Bruges Group will fight, and I'm sure you, Sir Desmond Swayne, will fight even harder for the freedoms and liberties that we ought to. And this was a great interview and a great conversation with Sir Desmond Swayne. Thank you very much.
Thank you.